I never imagined that the quiet life I had built with Ernest could unravel so quickly. It all started after Ernest's sudden death. The funeral had barely ended, and the house still smelled of lilies, when I noticed small, unsettling details. Papers misplaced, tiny amounts of money missing from our accounts, and those strange questions from Charles and Henry, my own sons. They seemed almost too interested in the insurance, and the finances Ernest had spent decades securing. At first, I tried to dismiss it as grief, thinking they were just lost and confused after losing their father, but my intuition wouldn't let me ignore the gnawing doubt. Something was off, terribly off. I found myself revisiting every moment before Ernest's death. How he had left the shop that morning, the way he spoke about his meetings, and even the slight unease on his face that I had assumed was stress. One afternoon, I received a note under the door. "We're watching out for you. Mom, don't worry." It wasn't from the postman. My heart raced, and a cold fear crept in. Why would someone leave a note like that? My mind kept circling back to Ernest's insurance policies. The amounts were huge, and suddenly it wasn't just about financial gain, it was about control. I tried asking Charles directly about the money. Ernest had withdrawn for renovations, but his explanations felt rehearsed and hollow. Henry kept sidestepping my questions, speaking with false concern. Even their cousin Jasmine, with her sweet voice, seemed too eager to help me, hovering at my kitchen door with tea and condescending reassurances. That day I realized something frightening. My sons weren't just careless or greedy, they were hiding something dark. Began documenting everything. Conversations, withdrawals, receipts, anything that seemed unusual. I felt paranoid, I admit it, but it was the kind of paranoia that stems from a gut instinct you cannot ignore. And then, that night, a message arrived on my phone. A name I didn't recognize. Stephen Callahan, a private investigator. "Your husband suspected danger. Meet me tomorrow at the corner cafe at 3 p.m., it said. The message was long, detailed, and terrifying. Ernest had suspected his own sons. He had feared for my safety. He had left instructions, evidence, and even someone to protect me in case the worst happened. I stared at the screen, trembling, realizing that my sons, the boys I had nurtured, could be capable of unimaginable betrayal. Knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth was out there, and I had to find it before they moved to finish what they had started. But would I get there in time? Or would their plan succeed before I could act? The next day, I would meet the man who held the answers to everything. But would I uncover the truth or walk straight into a trap? The following afternoon, I dressed carefully, choosing the purple dress I wore for important occasions, hoping it would give me strength. Every step toward the corner cafe was filled with tension. Shadows seemed to follow me, every passerby a potential spy. Could my sons already know I was onto them? I couldn't risk being careless, not now. The cafe was modest but cozy, the low hum of conversation masking my rising heartbeat. I went straight to the back table, as the message had instructed, and sat down, trying to steady my shaking hands. I ordered chamomile tea, though I barely tasted it. My mind was racing through every possible scenario. What if this Stephen Callahan was a scam? Or worse, what if he had been sent by Charles and Henry to lure me into something I couldn't escape? Exactly at 3 p.m., a man in his 50s approached, tall with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He introduced himself quietly. "Mrs. Hayes? I'm Stephen Callahan. I'm so sorry for your loss." Ernest was a remarkable man. There was a kindness in his eyes that calmed me slightly, but the knot in my stomach remained. He set a brown folder on the table, heavy with secrets. "I have to warn you," he said, lowering his voice. "What you're about to see is painful. Very painful. Are you ready?" I nodded, gripping the edge of the table. I had been preparing for this moment. Since the first strange note appeared under my door, Stephen pulled out a small voice recorder and pressed play. Ernest's voice, unmistakable and full of warmth even in fear, filled the quiet cafe. He spoke of his suspicions, the way Charles and Henry had been pressuring him about the insurance, their obsessive questions about my daily life, and a vitamin supplement that would end his life if he wasn't careful. My hands tightened into fists. Tears blurred my vision as I listened. The man I had shared my life with had not only anticipated his own death, but had also anticipated the betrayal of his own sons. He had left a plan, a trail of evidence, and someone to protect me if the worst happened. Stephen handed me photos showing Charles purchasing a small bottle, paying cash, and using a fake name. It was methanol, the very substance that had poisoned Ernest. Every word, every photo, every recording confirmed my darkest fears. My sons had not only murdered their father, but they were planning my death too. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me. How could the boys I had loved, raised, and sacrificed for become capable of such cold cruelty? Stephen looked at me, his voice gentle but firm. "We have enough to act, Mrs. Hayes, but time is critical. Tomorrow, they will try to declare you mentally incompetent, and that could block everything." I realized then that the war had already begun, and I had to move carefully but decisively. My mind raced with strategies, knowing that one wrong step could cost me my life. But one truth remained. I had Ernest's trust, his preparation, and now his evidence, and I would not let him or myself down. Tomorrow, the first move would be theirs. But I had a plan too, and it was a plan they would never see coming. That night I barely slept. My mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. I kept imagining Charles and Henry scheming, believing I was oblivious, thinking they could steal everything and dispose of me like an obstacle. I refused to let them win, not after everything Ernest and I had built together. The next morning, I stayed home, pretending to rest while my phone vibrated constantly with calls. First Charles, then Henry, each voice dripping with desperation, begging to know where I was. I ignored them all, heart pounding with both fear and a fierce resolve. I knew the police were already mobilizing thanks to Stephen. Their frantic attempts to reach me only confirmed that they were aware someone knew their plan. By mid-morning, Sergeant O'Connell arrived at my door, his expression serious yet reassuring. "Mrs. Hayes, your sons have been arrested," he said calmly. Relief crashed over me like a wave. I could hardly believe it. "How did they react?" I asked, my voice trembling. Charles denied everything at first, but when we played the recordings, he finally broke down. Henry tried to escape through the back window. "We had to chase him for 6 blocks, the sergeant explained. I felt a strange mixture of fear, relief, and sorrow. These were the children I had nurtured, yet they were gone to me forever. Stephen stayed nearby, keeping a watchful eye, ensuring nothing unexpected happened. I was exhausted, yet my mind couldn't rest. My sons had plotted murder for money, and the betrayal cut deeper than any grief I had ever known. But justice was finally within reach, and the knowledge that Ernest's death would not go unpunished brought a small, fierce comfort. Later that afternoon, Jasmine came to see me. Her face was pale. Tears streaked down her cheeks. "Mrs. Hayes, please, drop the charges. Charles isn't bad. It was the debts, the pressure. It's my fault too," she pleaded. I looked at her with cold clarity. "Your husband poisoned my husband. He planned to kill me as well. There is no excuse for that. And no, we are not dropping the charges. You need to leave my house," I said, my voice steady. She hesitated, then disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived. 3 days later, Ernest's body was exhumed. The lab results confirmed the truth I had already feared. Lethal levels of methanol, the poison that had stolen my husband. The evidence was irrefutable. My sons had murdered him, and they had done so. With chilling precision, the town was shocked when the news broke. Whispers spread. Newspapers reported the case as the most heinous crime of the decade. People I barely knew came forward to express their support. But I was only focused on one thing: ensuring justice was done. Ernest deserved that, and I would see to it, no matter the personal cost. I finally had proof, but the real challenge was yet to come: the trial. And my sons, the boys I had loved, would be facing the consequences of their monstrous actions. The trial loomed over me like a storm cloud. For 2 months, I barely slept, haunted by the memory of Ernest and the betrayal of my sons. Stephen was my anchor, guiding me through the legal preparations and keeping me focused. Every day we went over the recordings, the photographs, the documents, every piece of evidence that would finally reveal the truth. The day arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters, neighbors, and even people I didn't know were all curious to witness the case of the killer sons. Charles and Henry entered, dressed in prison jumpsuits and handcuffed, their faces a mix of defiance and dread. Seeing them there, I felt a pang of sorrow, but it was overshadowed by resolve. They were no longer my children in any meaningful way. They were the architects of a murder, and they had to answer for it. The prosecutor opened with precision, painting the full picture. He played the recordings first, Charles and Henry plotting Ernest's murder, discussing the methanol, calculating the timing, even planning my own death. Each play sent a shiver through the room. I could see gasps, murmurs of disbelief, and tears from the audience. My stomach churned, but I held my head high. This was the moment the truth would finally emerge. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand with trembling legs but a clear mind. I looked directly at Charles and Henry. I raised them with love and sacrificed everything for their well-being. I never imagined they could become capable of something so monstrous, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I trusted them completely. Their father trusted them completely, and they repaid that trust with betrayal and murder. The defense tried to argue desperate circumstances, debts, and influence, but every lie crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Stephen's testimony corroborated everything: Ernest's foresight, the recordings, the photographs of methanol purchases, the falsified death certificate, and the plan they had plotted for me. The medical examiner presented the exhumation results, confirming lethal methanol in Ernest's system. The closing arguments were relentless. The prosecutor's words cut through the courtroom like steel. Charles and Henry Hayes are not victims. They are predators. They saw their parents as obstacles. They planned, executed, and covered up murder. They do not deserve mercy. They deserve justice. I sat there, listening, my hands clenched, as the jury deliberated for hours. Every second stretched endlessly. When they finally returned, the room held its breath. The judge's words were clear and decisive. Guilty on all counts. Life sentences without parole. A weight lifted from me. A mixture of relief, sorrow, and grim satisfaction. Ernest's death would not go unanswered. Justice had been served for Ernest, but the story wasn't over. There were still consequences to face and a bitter truth about my sons that I would have to come to terms with in the days to come. The weight in my chest lifted when the verdict was announced, but relief was tinged with an ache I couldn't ignore. My sons, Charles and Henry, had been found guilty. Justice, cold and absolute, had been served. I felt no triumph, no joy in their downfall. Only sorrow for what they had become and relief that Ernest's death had not been in vain. I had been waiting for this day for months. Yet now that it had arrived, I felt an odd emptiness. The people around me cheered quietly, offering hugs and whispered words of comfort. But none of that could touch the quiet storm inside. Charles slumped in his chair, the reality of his actions finally crashing over him. Henry remained stiff, staring forward as if the verdict hadn't touched him. But I saw the shadow of guilt in his eyes. Jasmine predictably did not appear. I had expected her absence. Her loyalty had never extended beyond her own interests. After the trial, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only those who had been directly involved in the process. Stephen stayed by my side throughout, a silent guardian and witness to my ordeal. His presence grounded me, a reminder that I was no longer entirely alone in navigating this new reality. I clutched my coat around me as we stepped outside, the crisp air filling my lungs. The world felt surreal, as if I had been living underwater and was now finally breathing. Again, 3 days later, I received the news I had dreaded yet half expected. Charles had taken his own life in his cell. A note, brief and trembling with guilt, confessed everything, expressed regret, and admitted the irreparable harm they had caused. Reading it, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Charles had finally acknowledged his crimes, though in the most irreversible way. Henry, however, was left alone to grapple with the consequences. He had suffered a complete breakdown and was now under psychiatric supervision, haunted by both his actions and the death of his brother. Life slowly resumed a fragile rhythm. I returned to my house, no longer a place of fear, but a home where memories of Ernest could coexist with my resolve to heal. The shop, once a place of tragedy, I transformed into a garden. Flowers bloomed where sorrow had lingered. Red roses, white carnations, and bright sunflowers reaching toward the sun, symbols of resilience and memory. Stephen became more than a friend. He became family, visiting weekly to share stories and laughter, anchoring me to a life I could now embrace. Evenings spent in quiet reflection became my solace. I often visited Ernest's grave, bringing flowers and speaking to him about the progress of the foundation we had started and the justice brought to other families because of our story. I felt him near in those moments, a comforting presence urging me forward, reminding me that despite betrayal and loss, love and justice could still prevail. Yet even with justice served, the past whispered through my life, reminding me that some wounds never fully heal. Reminding me that some wounds never fully heal. There were still letters unopened, questions unanswered, and a family forever changed. How would I face those remnants of the past? And could peace ever truly be mine? Life after the trial felt strange, almost unreal. The house that had once felt like a trap now felt like a refuge, a space where I could breathe again without the constant shadow of betrayal looming over me. I walked through the rooms, touching objects that held memories of Ernest. His favorite chair by the window, the old clock that ticked softly in the hall, and the photographs of our family before greed had poisoned everything. The house was no longer a monument to fear and deception. It was a place where I could honor the life I had shared with Ernest and the love that had endured, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. I threw myself into the garden, transforming Ernest's old shop into a sanctuary of life and color. Red roses, white carnations, sunflowers, and violets, flowers Ernest had loved, now grew where the shadows of sorrow had once lingered. Each petal, each bloom, felt like a small act of defiance against the cruelty of my sons. I would spend hours planting, watering and tending to them, finding comfort in their steady, quiet growth. Even the neighbors took notice, commenting on the beauty and serenity that now radiated from the garden. For the first time since Ernest's death, I felt a sense of purpose beyond grief. Stephen visited every Wednesday without fail, bringing a sense of stability and calm to my life. We would sit on the porch, drinking coffee, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes he recounted other cases, but mostly we shared stories of ordinary life, laughter, and the small victories that came with rebuilding. He had become family, a chosen family, and I realized that bonds of trust and loyalty could sometimes be stronger than those of blood. Yet, even with justice served and a peaceful life taking shape, remnants of the past lingered. Letters from Henry arrived sporadically, filled with incoherent apologies, desperate cries for forgiveness, and the hollow echoes of guilt. I kept them tucked away in a shoebox, a quiet reminder that the past could not reach me if I chose not to let it. Jasmine had vanished, leaving only whispers behind, someone who had chosen self-preservation over morality. The betrayal had cut deep, but I refused to let it define the rest of my life. Also dedicated myself to the foundation we had, created with Ernest's life insurance money, the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family. Crimes became more than just an organization, it became a lifeline for people who had suffered in silence. Families received legal aid, psychological support, and investigative help. Their gratitude was overwhelming, and every success reminded me why I had fought so hard for justice. Each person helped was a testament to the power of truth, courage, and perseverance. But even as the garden flourished and the foundation grew, questions lingered in the quiet of the night. Could the wounds of betrayal ever fully fade? Or would the shadows of the past forever whisper in my ear? After the trial, I found that life had changed in ways I hadn't expected. The house, once a place of fear and betrayal, now breathed life and hope. But my heart still ached from the loss of the children I had raised, the ones I thought I knew. It was hard not to dwell on the what-ifs, the moments when perhaps a word, a glance, or an action could have changed the course of events. But I refused to live in regret. Ernest had taught me that strength wasn't the absence of pain, but the courage to move forward despite it. I poured myself into the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. Every week, new cases arrived. Stories of families broken by greed, betrayal, and sometimes violence. Parents threatened by children, siblings fighting over inheritance, spouses manipulated or deceived. So many tragedies mirrored what had happened to me. And every time I listened to someone else's story, I felt both sorrow and resolve. I understood their pain intimately, but I also knew that justice could prevail, and that hope could rise from even the deepest betrayal. One case in particular shook me. A woman named Eleanor came to the foundation, terrified that her brother was planning to kill her for money, just as my own sons had done to Ernest and me. Her fear was palpable. I saw myself reflected in her eyes, the same hesitation, the same quiet terror. We provided her with legal counsel, a private investigator, and psychological support, working tirelessly to protect her while gathering evidence. Watching her courage grow reminded me of my own journey, how I had been forced to stand against betrayal and fight for what was right. When her brother was convicted months later, she hugged me and cried, whispering, "You saved my life." It was a moment of profound affirmation that all the pain I had endured had not been in vain. Even with these successes, I made time for myself. I tended the garden daily, each flower a symbol of endurance, love, and remembrance. I walked through the house, listening to the echoes of laughter and conversations that no longer belonged to my sons, but to memories of happier days with Ernest. Stephen remained a constant presence, our Wednesday coffees becoming a ritual of comfort, friendship, and shared reflection. Yet, every now and then, the past would knock softly at my door. Letters from Henry arrived occasionally, filled with incoherent confessions, apologies, and rambling remorse. I left them unopened, choosing instead to preserve the peace I had fought so hard to earn. Forgiveness, I realized, was not for him. It was for me. I would not allow his guilt, or my lingering grief, to cloud the life I had rebuilt. But just when I began to feel truly secure in my new life, a case came to the foundation that reminded me how quickly darkness could return. A new family, a familiar pattern of greed and deception, and a chilling question whispered to me. Could history repeat itself, even when the past seemed closed? The new case arrived quietly, almost like a shadow slipping into the foundation's inbox. A young woman named Clarissa reached out, fearful that her brother was plotting against her for the family inheritance. As I read her message, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The details: suspicious behavior, secretive conversations, sudden financial interest in her life, echoed the nightmare I had lived through. I felt the familiar pang of dread, the knot of fear that had tightened in my chest when I first realized my sons were capable of murder. When Clarissa came to meet me, I could see the terror in her eyes and the hesitation in her movements. She reminded me of myself 2 years ago, uncertain whom to trust, unsure of how to proceed, and haunted by the possibility that those closest to her might betray her. I listened carefully, asking questions that were precise and measured. Every answer she gave, every hesitation, was a thread leading to the truth. We quickly mobilized the Foundation's resources. Stephen and I worked together, analyzing her brother's behavior, tracking financial records, and reviewing communications. I felt the familiar adrenaline of vigilance, the quiet thrill of being steps ahead of someone who believed they were untouchable. I also felt the weight of responsibility. I knew too well what failure could mean, and I refused to let this woman suffer the same way I had. But as we dug deeper, I began noticing subtle differences. While my sons had been driven purely by greed and desperation, Clarissa's brother seemed motivated by a tangled web of jealousy, entitlement, and long-standing resentment. It reminded me painfully of my own sons, and I realized how easily love and familiarity could be twisted into something dark. I explained to Clarissa that fear was natural, but careful planning and evidence could turn vulnerability into protection. Throughout the investigation, I couldn't help but reflect on my own journey. I remembered the fear that had once gripped me in my kitchen, the sleepless nights staring at photographs of my son's innocence, and the resolve that had transformed grief into action. I also remembered Ernest, his cautious foresight, his insistence on preparation, and the quiet bravery that had saved my life even in death. His lessons were embedded in everything I did now. As evidence accumulated, I could see the change in Clarissa. Her posture straightened, her voice grew steadier, and the shadows in her eyes began to lift. For the first time since arriving, she smiled, a cautious, grateful smile that reminded me of mornings in Ernest's garden, the sunlight spilling over flowers he had once planted. But just as the first signs of hope emerged, an anonymous message arrived at the Foundation, a cryptic warning. Some truths are more dangerous than lies. Watch your back, Mrs. Hayes. My heart skipped a beat. Could someone from my past be watching, waiting for a chance to try again? The anonymous message unsettled me more than I expected. I had thought the nightmare of Charles and Henry was behind me, that justice had closed that chapter of my life. But the warning, so deliberately vague yet unmistakably threatening, reminded me that vigilance is never optional when you've faced true betrayal. I showed it to Stephen, who frowned deeply, his fingers tapping the table in thought. This could be a prank, he said cautiously. But we can't take chances. Someone knows how to push your buttons. We tightened security at the Foundation, reviewing all access points and monitoring the phone lines. I felt the familiar tension coil in my stomach, the same tightness I had felt when waiting in the corner cafe for Stephen to deliver the first recordings about Ernest. I realized, painfully, that trauma leaves a permanent echo in the mind, and some threats, even unfulfilled, never truly fade. Meanwhile, Clarissa's case was reaching a critical point. Her brother's behavior grew more erratic. Late-night phone calls, sudden withdrawals from accounts, and unexplained absences. Each small clue brought a wave of dread but also clarity. I remembered how I had traced Charles buying methanol, and I felt a surge of determination. The same patience, the same attention to detail, and the same instinct that had saved me before had to work again. One evening, as Stephen and I were reviewing the recordings we had gathered, Clarissa called me in a panic. "I think he knows I've spoken to you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He came to the house tonight. I hid in the basement." My heart raced. I told her to stay calm, to remain hidden, and that Stephen and I were on our way. The feeling of urgency, of impending danger, was unmistakable. As we arrived, I felt the familiar sense of history repeating itself. The fear, the disbelief, the raw awareness that someone close could harm you, it all came rushing back. We secured Clarissa's safety and immediately contacted law enforcement, presenting the evidence we had collected. The police responded quickly, this time without hesitation or corruption. Watching her brother being taken into custody, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Justice, once again, had a way of prevailing, but not without fear, struggle, and the bitter knowledge of human cruelty. Afterward, as I sat in my garden with Stephen, I reflected on how fragile trust can be and how easily love can be twisted into betrayal. I thought about my sons, about their greed and moral corruption, and about the children they once were, the innocent souls now lost forever. And yet, I also thought about the new life I had created, the hope I could bring to others, and the power of vigilance combined with truth. But just as I allowed myself a moment of quiet relief, I received another envelope slipped under the door. No name, no message, just a photograph of my garden. Just a photograph of my garden, and a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the frame. Someone was watching. Someone was not finished with me yet. I stared at the photograph on my kitchen table, my hands trembling despite the calm I had worked so hard to cultivate over the years. The shadowy figure at the edge of my garden wasn't just a stranger, it was a reminder that the past never truly leaves you, and that those who once sought to harm you can leave echoes that linger for years. Stephen looked at me with concern. "Margot," he said gently, "this could be a threat, or just someone trying to scare you. Either way, we handle it the same way, cautiously and with evidence." That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house and every rustle in the garden sent my heart racing, but I forced myself to remember the lessons I had learned over the past few years. Patience, strategy, and vigilance are stronger than fear. I set up cameras in the garden and installed motion sensors, turning the house into a quiet fortress. It was strange how a widow, who once lived freely and confidently, now measured every step, every shadow. But I could not afford to be careless. Not after what I had survived. The following morning, the recordings from the night's surveillance confirmed my suspicions. The shadowy figure had returned, lingering near the garden while pretending to admire the flowers. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was intentional. Someone knew I was here and they wanted to intimidate me. But who? The town had always been close-knit, yet I could think of only a few who might harbor lingering resentment or curiosity about my past struggles. I showed Stephen the footage. His eyes narrowed. "They're testing your response," he said. "They want to see how you react. This is psychological. We need to find out who it is before it escalates." Days passed, each one stretching into anxiety-laden hours. I spent more time at the foundation, helping families, keeping my mind focused, and yet, the shadow in the photograph haunted me. It reminded me of my sons, Charles and Henry, and the ruthless calculation they had carried in their hearts. I thought about their letters, the desperate confessions, and the horror of betrayal by those closest to you. How quickly love can turn to violence when greed becomes the compass. Then came the breakthrough. A neighbor, Mrs. Langford, called me quietly. "Margot, I saw a man near your garden at dusk a few nights ago. He's not from around here. I recognized him from the city." My pulse quickened. Finally, a lead. I coordinated with Stephen and the local police to track this stranger's movements. We learned he was connected to an organized crime circle that had been trying to exploit wealthy widows for financial gain. It was a revelation, yes, but also terrifying. The danger had escalated from personal betrayal to something larger, more impersonal, and potentially more lethal. As Stephen and I planned our next steps, I realized the shadow wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Someone wanted to see if I had the courage and cunning to survive again, and I knew deep down I would not let fear control me, not this time. But would my strength be enough to uncover the truth before it was too late? The following evening, Stephen and I prepared for a stakeout near the garden. I had grown used to nights filled with tension, but this felt different, more personal. I knew that every shadow could hide danger, every stranger could have sinister intent. We sat quietly in the living room, the glow from the surveillance monitors reflecting off my face. My hands gripped a cup of chamomile tea, though the warmth did little to calm the racing thoughts. "Margot," Stephen whispered, "we need to stay alert, but we can't let fear dictate our actions." I nodded. I had survived betrayal once. I could survive it again. Hours passed. The town's quiet streets seemed to mock our vigilance until a figure emerged at the edge of the garden. The stranger moved cautiously, almost theatrically, inspecting the flowers as if I were oblivious to his presence. My pulse thudded in my ears. Stephen gestured for me to stay back while he called the police. But I couldn't sit idly by. Something in his posture, the way he hesitated near the roses Ernest had loved, told me that this was no casual visitor. He was testing me. Finally, he made a move that gave him away. He reached for the garden gate, checking to see if it was locked. I stepped onto the porch, my voice steady but firm. "Stop right there." The man froze, caught off guard. His eyes widened when he realized he had been seen, and I noticed a faint glint of fear. Fear of someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Stephen appeared beside me, quietly but decisively. The man hesitated, then turned and ran down the street, disappearing into the shadows. We called the police immediately, giving them a detailed description, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he returned, or sent someone else. The next morning, the investigation yielded results. The stranger was identified as a man named Leonard, linked to a city-based criminal network that had a history of targeting vulnerable widows for financial gain. But what puzzled me most was how he had found me. I had always been careful, protective of our home and our lives. It seemed the past had a way of catching up, even years later. Stephen reassured me. "We'll find every connection, Margot. He won't have the opportunity to harm you or anyone connected to your family." But despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake a sense of déjà vu, the feeling that someone had circled back to finish unfinished business. As I walked through the garden later that day, I touched the red roses, remembering Ernest's love for them. I realized that fear would never dominate me again, but vigilance was now a permanent part of my life. Every flower, every corner of the house, became both a memory and a safeguard. I understood that some threats aren't always personal. They are calculated and impersonal, yet they demand the same courage and wisdom that I had relied on before. I knew that. Leonard's intrusion was only the beginning. Someone had tracked me here for a reason, and I had a choice: retreat into fear or confront the shadow of the past once and for all. But could I unravel the full truth before he, or someone even more dangerous, luck again? The days that followed Leonard's failed attempt were tense but revealing. Stephen and I dug deeper, tracing his connections to a larger network of criminals who preyed on widows, exploiting grief and trust. What I thought had been a simple act of intimidation turned out to be a carefully orchestrated plan. Leonard was just a messenger, a small piece of a much bigger scheme. The realization made me shiver, but it also ignited a determination I hadn't felt in years. I would not be a victim. Ernest's memory and the truth we had fought so hard to uncover were my armor. We coordinated with the police and managed to lure Leonard into a trap. It was quick, precise, and utterly satisfying to see the network exposed. Leonard and his associates were arrested, and the evidence we had collected ensured they could never harm anyone again. For the first time in a long while, I felt true closure, not just for Ernest, but for myself. I had faced betrayal, greed, and mortal danger, yet I stood unbroken, returning home. I walked through the garden, my fingers brushing the soft petals of the flowers Ernest had loved. Each bloom symbolized endurance, love, and the victories we had won together. I knew that life would always bring challenges, but I had learned something invaluable: courage, love, and the relentless pursuit of truth can overcome even the darkest of human intentions. Stephen, sitting on the porch with his warm smile, reminded me that family isn't only defined by blood. It's defined by loyalty, support, and shared values. I had built a new kind of family with him and with All the people whose lives were touched by the foundation. I paused to reflect, thinking of Charles, Henry, and the sons I had lost to greed and darkness. I no longer felt anger, only a quiet pity for the men they became. The innocence of the children they once were had vanished, replaced by choices that led them to destruction. And yet I did not dwell on regret. I had chosen justice, truth, and the chance to protect others from suffering the same fate. My story had become bigger than personal tragedy. It had transformed into hope, inspiration, and a testament to resilience. Life continued in quiet beauty. I tended the garden, met with families helped by the foundation, and spent peaceful afternoons with Stephen. The house felt warm again, alive with memories, not haunted by fear or betrayal. And while Ernest could never return, his love, wisdom, and foresight guided every step I took. My journey taught me that even in the face of betrayal by those closest to you, courage and truth can restore peace. No lie can outlive the light of justice, and no act of love is ever wasted. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, real-life tales of courage, betrayal, and triumph, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me bring more incredible stories to life, and I can't wait to share the next one with you. Thank you for joining me on this journey. You've witnessed the power of truth, and together we keep it alive.